Hello. In this clip, I would like to share some of the insights I've gained in the past years on stakeholder engagement. Stakeholder engagement starts with involving stakeholders as much as possible in the stakeholder analysis and engagement planning. Who should be involved in which activities, in which way? There are different methods for stakeholder analysis. Listing the stakeholders with their stakes based on roles and mandates and their influence, filling in the power interest grid, drawing a spider's web, and drawing a rich picture, and many more. The often used power interest grid helps you categorize the stakeholders according to their power and their interest, and helps you decide how you could engage the different groups. It is generally assumed that those with high power and high interest in the top right are the ones you should engage closely and influence actively. And, for instance, the stakeholders with high interest and low power, bottom right, you only keep informed. One can argue, however, whether in view of social inclusiveness, that is what you should want. I found that in different sessions, it is quite tempting to fill in the matrix right away, because it's relatively easy and therefore it is an easy tool to make people active. However, it is more helpful to first list the different stakeholders and identify their different interests, tasks, roles and mandates, and then score their relative interest and power influence. After that exercise, the power influence matrix can be filled in. Here are some examples of the tools that I have been using. On the left, the power interest grid, used for a water management plan in Mexico. At the top right are the stakeholders that are considered both powerful and having a large stake interest. At the right-hand side, a less used tool, the spider's diagram. In this case, used for a stakeholder analysis in the Netherlands. The bigger the circles, the bigger the power. And the closer the circles are to the center, the bigger their interest in the particular problem or intervention. I find this a helpful tool because it visualizes the differences very nicely. A very interesting tool I find the rich picture. Here on the left, as used for a flood situation in Central Java, Indonesia. People, stakeholders or actors, are asked to draw the situation in a certain area, and they depict the stakeholders, actors, and the problems. And the nice thing of a rich picture is that by drawing it, people use their right brain, their feelings and intuition. And as such, it very much complements the left brain rational methods that are more commonly used. Not all stakeholders can, need, or want to be involved in the same intensity. Already in 1969, Arnstein came up with the idea of a participation ladder, of which the lower rungs represent low levels of citizen participation, and the higher rungs, high levels of participation. Later, the terms that Arnstein used were changed, but the idea is the same. Different stakeholders are engaged at different levels, from being only informed, to being consulted, to being invited, to cooperate, to co-deciding. Each level has a different amount of influence and also a different amount of effort expected from the stakeholders. The more influence or gain one gets, the more effort, cost, one is expected to spend. Once we know the different stakeholders' score as far as power and interest is concerned, we can consider the different levels of engagement we want to invite them to. Notice that you cannot force stakeholders to participate. It remains their choice. This bullseye is an even simpler representation of different levels of engagement and intensity, combined with 4 different categories of stakeholders in the corners: decision makers, contributors, executors, and users. These categories you can use as a kind of a checklist might some stakeholders have been overlooked? An example is this bullseye filled in for a relatively simple wetland restoration project in Romania. Ideally, the positioning of stakeholders is checked with the different stakeholders, like we did here in a simple way with stakeholders in the water management plan in the Kromme Rijn area in the Netherlands. We drew lines on a whiteboard, explained the differences between the different circles, and we asked the stakeholders to actually replace the sticky notes with the name of the organization if they wanted. One nature NGO, for instance, moved itself outward as they did not have the capacity to attend all the meetings and felt sufficiently represented by another organization. By checking this positioning with the stakeholders, we involve them. We check whether what we came up with is feasible, and we make them co-responsible for the process. This is a more complicated example from an integrated coastal zone management project in the Gulf area. At the left side, you can see the power interest grid, and you can see how we drew lines between different groups of stakeholders, and subsequently we identified different levels of engagement and appointed different stakeholders to the different levels. At the right-hand side, you see how the different stakeholder groups are placed in different rings in the bullseye. Co-know, co-think, cooperate, and co-decide. Most of the stakeholders at the top right in the power interest grid ended up in the co-decide or cooperate circle in the bullseye. For me, when starting to prepare stakeholder meetings, it is very helpful to reflect a moment and ask myself, which conscious or subconscious picture do I have of interacting with the stakeholders? Do I see myself as pouring knowledge in the heads like an assembly line worker? Or like taking a diagnosis like a doctor? Or am I trying to sell them something like a salesperson? Or do I see my role as much more reactive or less active, like a farmer who can prepare the ground but has to wait to see the harvest? Or do I see myself as a fellow traveler, mutually sharing knowledge? Or as a nature lover who just enjoys watching without influencing the growth and the blooming? How I see my interaction greatly determines my attitude as well as the type of activities I will choose. Why don't you pause this clip now and reflect for a moment on what you find an appropriate picture for how you would want to interact with stakeholders in general or in a particular case you have in mind. Besides identifying the stakeholders and their desired level of engagement, there are a few other important questions we need to consider. Does the institutional environment enable a participation process? Is there room for real participation with the stakeholders, with the decision makers, with the project management, in the setup of the project? In a former communist country, I was once asked to train and advise on a participation process where the organization that was supposed to guide the participation process was very hierarchical. And that made it extremely difficult for the management and the employees to let stakeholders really participate in decision making. In such a case, it might be better to postpone or cancel the participation process in order to not ruin possible stakeholder engagement in the future. And of course, you need to be clear on what the intended outcome is and what the playing field is. What can be discussed and what cannot be discussed? What will the status of the outcome be? Will it be binding? For whom? And then, what do you know or think the stakeholders themselves want or expect? How motivated are they? Is there something in it for them? If so, they will be motivated, and you will not have a problem with so-called stakeholder fatigue. Whenever possible, I alternately meet one-on-one with stakeholders and in a group. People say different things when you meet them one-on-one, like the fruit farmer in the Kromme Rijn area, where in the Netherlands, who proudly shows his fruit trees and says some things, or the fishmonger in Sao Tome, who shows the amount of fish he sold. I find that most people don't mind me bringing up that information in the plenary, even if they wouldn't have done so themselves. In the plenary, most of the work is done by the participants themselves, especially when the group is heterogeneous and people have different stakes and perspectives. People hear from each other and eventually negotiate. A stakeholder engagement process is a process, not just one meeting. Preferably, you can meet more often with the same stakeholders, as a group and individually. What I like to say is one meeting is no meeting. In a first meeting, whether one-on-one or in a group, people get acquainted, find out who is who and who wants what, and they recognize each other as fellow humans. If there is the pressure of having to have a result at the end of the first meeting, it might make the getting to know each other less effective and therefore make the whole interaction process less effective. With the second or third meeting, I have experienced that the participants have developed a connection if they had not done so already before, and that it was easier to crack hard nuts. In the slide, you see an example of what we call a nested approach that we used in the Kromme Rijn area in the Netherlands, where different types of farmers had different wishes regarding the water management. And with nested, we mean that the smaller group was also part of the larger group and helped reach that larger group in project meetings, but also outside the project meetings. We had a core group that met quite often and helped prepare for the advisory group meetings. And those advisory group meetings also help prepare for the larger public meetings. Inviting participants in an appropriate way, I found is very important, and that's different in different countries. In Sao Tome, for instance, announcing the meeting one day before was sufficient. But in other countries, it had to be 1 or even 2 weeks before. And it had to be on official paper with the right signatures and stamps in order to be responded to. I also find that, especially when sensing reluctance, it is important to give participants an escape. For example, that at the start they don't have to commit to any outcome of the process. And fortunately, most of the time the process did its work. At the end, people felt co-ownership of the outcome and had no problem committing to it. Clever planning and agenda setting is also very helpful, especially in the beginning. It gives the participants the feeling that they know what they can expect and gives them a safe environment. Good working conditions during the meeting is also very important. The room can communicate a lot and can determine whether participants feel happy. This means you have to take care of enough space and fresh air and water and other beverages if appropriate. And pre-prepare the room in a way that is helpful for you, for how you design the process. I like to regularly break out in small groups. That can be in separate rooms, but sometimes it's desirable that the people remain in the same room or other rooms are simply not available. When we have one big enough room available, I prefer a cabaret setting. Several round tables spread over the room. That gives a less formal atmosphere and it's helpful to break out in small groups. Even though I like the process to do its work, as a facilitator I definitely have influence. Much of what happens in the group is a reflection of what I as facilitator communicate. And everything hinges on trust in stakeholder participation and thus on transparency. If I'm not completely independent, for instance because I'm paid by the ministry, I'd better be transparent about it. I try to know the stakeholders as much as possible before I meet them, by reading about them, by hearing from others, but most of all, of course, by interacting with them. And developing rapport begins long before the actual meeting. Probably you would have met several people already before if you have a stakeholder participation process, or you have talked to someone on the phone. Developing rapport can, of course, also happen very effectively in informal meetings. With the mayor in Eastern Europe, I played chess on his veranda, and this greatly helped in the more formal meetings. And before the meeting starts, I want to be ready to welcome the stakeholders and interact with them and show a genuine interest in them as persons. I also try to be knowledgeable, of course, about the culture and about what is considered appropriate or inappropriate, including what type of sense of humor is acceptable. I try to be relaxed, listen to what people say, and indeed I try to use humor as much as possible. I experienced that in humor, although there are differences, we have more in common than we have differences. Everybody likes humor. I also try to at least know some words in the language that most people in the audience speak. And in this all, I keep in mind that it is the process that must do the work, not me. I only facilitate the process. And when I start an actual meeting, I found it helpful to establish some rules for the meeting. You could call them household rules. And also, of course, rules for the whole process. And it's very helpful to ask the participants what the rules of the meetings will be. I find out that what they find important, it creates co-responsibility. I found it very useful in different settings, for instance in Indonesia, to have rules about the use of telephones, like point 4 on the flip chart at the right-hand side of the slide. And I guess it will not be very different in other countries. Of course, setting a rule is no guarantee, but gently reminding people of their own rules can help to have a good working atmosphere. It's very important to establish the process with the stakeholders, the whole process, and thus the rules for the process. At the end, people might disagree because of different interests about problems and solutions, but they might agree on the process, how to identify problems and identify appropriate interventions. This will help people to accept the outcome of the process, even if for them individually the result is not the best. In the Kromme Rijn process, one of the farmers' representatives said, yes, I can see that given the process, this is the best outcome. And I accept it as a member of this group. But I, as individual farmer, will file a protest. And my conclusion was that he had really understood and that the process had been good. As I mentioned before, I really like to break out in small groups with a plenary introduction before and reporting back after the breakout groups. This allows more people to actively participate and also prevents some people dominating the whole meeting. Besides, it makes it possible for the people to discuss in their own language without having to use a translator when I or other facilitators or experts do not master their language. And lastly, it gives me a break, so I can walk around, talk to other people, and or prepare for the next part of the meeting. There are several other tools that help make the sessions lively, enjoyable, and productive. Maps are extremely helpful to make clear for everybody what we are talking about and where a concrete problem or solution is located. While pointing out locations, other aspects will spontaneously surface and can be written on the map. Role plays are not only fun to do, but they are very helpful for participants to understand the perspective of other stakeholders. This so-called role reversal is a tool that is used in counseling, but can also be very effective in stakeholder engagement. Depending on the group and the dynamics, most likely best for a second or third meeting, not the first. Some role-play aspects have been captured in serious games, like the one the people in Kuwait are playing at the left-hand side. Other games, like the puzzle in the top right-hand corner at a meeting in Bangladesh, are helpful to understand the importance of cooperation and might be good at a first meeting. In the Kromme Rijn case in the Netherlands, we developed a board game which made it easier for the participants to answer hard evaluation questions, besides creating a very nice atmosphere. Excursions in between meetings are always extremely good. They show, of course, even better than maps, where the problems and the solutions are or could be. And they also give an opportunity for people to interact informally. Voting is another way of engaging participants in the process, besides giving useful information. And the picture at the right-hand side of this slide shows how important stakeholders in Central Java found the different issues that were mentioned by putting dots on a flip chart. There are multiple ways to engage people in a meeting. we just have to give our and others' creativity room for it. When wrapping up a meeting, I try to remember and remind that it is not just a meeting we are interested in, but a whole stakeholder engagement process, of which the one meeting is one link. I want to make sure that at the end of the meeting, I identify with the participants what are the main conclusions and what we agree on, what should be done, and when, and by whom. And making a short report that not only reflects the content, but also captures some of the atmosphere, I found to be very helpful. This can be done by pictures, if participants don't object, or other means. And in between meetings, I try to follow up on the participants, especially on those who are expected to do something, and check whether they have all the information or resources they need, and whether I can assist them in any way. I do hope that you will find out, like I did in the past years, that when you like people and result, there's nothing nicer than an effective stakeholder engagement process. Good luck.